Hi scholars, happy Tuesday. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 9, Battle of the Little Bighorn. Before we get started, make sure you check the video description beneath this and then open up your reader. I'm still getting a lot of questions about scholars not finding their digital reader. Kind of been using it for like a month and a half now, so make sure you have it so you can get full credit on your notes. Going over our big question of the day. Why was the Battle of the Little Bighorn important in the shared history of the European settlers and Native Americans? So we're going to answer this for both the settlers and Americans at the time, Native Americans at the time. Why did it matter for Europeans? Why did it matter for Native Americans? Our I can statement for the day. I can explain the importance of the Battle of the Little Bighorn in history based on specific info from the text. Basically, you'll be able to answer our big question. Some vocabulary we're going to see today in Battle of the Little Bighorn. The word conflict. It's a war or battle that is a part of a larger war. You've probably heard the word conflict, though, usually in a smaller scale, like a conflict between friends, like an argument. If there's some kind of like argument or disagreement, you might call it a conflict. Today we're talking about it in a big scale, like a war or a battle. The next one is revelry. It's an early morning bugle or drum call signaling soldiers to report to duty. So if you've ever seen an old movie or TV show where like someone gets up and they have like a little drum going down through all the tents, or they have a little horn doing like the do 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 do, that's basically a revelry. It's a way just to alert all soldiers to report for duty. And lastly, chaos is complete confusion or disorder. So if something is chaotic, it means everyone's confused, everything's disorganized. You might heard a parent or guardian say that your room is chaos before because there's so much disorder. There's no order whatsoever. For our word work, I want you to finish this practice sentence on your own. I made a reckless decision when ... What is a reckless decision someone can do? Remember, reckless means that you are not being careful or paying attention. Hi, scholars. We're going to be starting reading Chapter 9. We're going to be reading the introduction on page 74 and 75. It looks a little bit like this. At the very top, make sure you have your reader open digitally. It's in the video description below. Give me that one moment, actually. I'm going to turn up the lights. There, that's better. Starting at the top of Chapter 9. In previous chapters, you've read about the conflict between Native Americans and settlers moving west. This is the story of the Battle of the Little Bighorn. It's an event that stands out in the history of this conflict. Lieutenant Charles Varnum was awake before revelry this morning. In fact, he had not slept at all the night before, and he was not alone, for there was going to be a battle that day, and everyone knew it. He watched the sunrise and light fog drifting across the wide prairies of southern Montana. This was a pleasant place to be in the summertime, even if you had to wear a heavy wool uniform like Varnum and his fellow cavalrymen. So these men were already up early, they were expecting a fight that day. The troops were camped in a little river valley. The day before, Varnum had noticed silvery rainbow trout in the nearby creek. And perhaps, the thought had crossed his mind, it would be nice to spend the day fishing besides that creek. However, Varnum knew very well the day would have no time for relaxation or leisure. They were at war, and the enemy was near. In fact, according to his scouts, the enemy was just on the other side of that river. The war became known as the Black Hills War because much of the fighting was in or around the Black Hills of South Dakota. Later, it was also referred to as the Great Sioux War of 1876. Lieutenant Varnum was in the 7th Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. This is one of many Indian wars and other bloody conflicts between Native Americans and U.S. forces. So far you should just know there is the leader of the scouts, Varnum, and then his commander, Custer. They were about to participate in another fight in the Indian Wars. Picking up at the top of page 75. As Chief of Scouts, Lieutenant Varnum gathered intelligence or important information about the enemy's location and strength. Varnum had a tough, ragtag group of men under his command. The scouts included warriors from the Arikara and Crow tribes. These people once fought the U.S. soldiers too, but had surrendered and moved on to the reservations. Their tracking skills and knowledge of other tribes were very useful. So they had already had some other Native Americans that were a part of this U.S. regiment, which is a collection of soldiers that would help them talk to other tribes, know the land, people who were already familiar with the area. In this case, it was these two tribes, the Crow tribe and the Arikara tribe, that had already surrendered in the past to the government. The day before, June 25th, Varnum sent his scouts to explore the banks of the Little Bighorn River. They reported finding a very large Lakota Sioux village. They said that there were many warriors in the village, but they did not know exactly how many. They only knew it was very big, with hundreds of teepees. As was his duty, Varnum reported this information to Custer, his commander. So Varnum's not in charge. He's in charge of the scouts that get information, and he brings it back to the commander, Custer, who makes the big decisions. Picking up on page 76 and 77, at the very top. Custer wanted to see this village, so Varnum and his scouts took him to the top of the nearest hill. From there, they could see smoke from the campfires and could see a few teepees and horses, but not much else. Custer wanted to attack the village, but the Arikara and Crow scouts protested, saying that they had never seen such a large village. Nonetheless, Custer saw this as an opportunity to deal a major blow to the enemy and maybe end the war, so he ordered his men to prepare for an attack. Years earlier, during the Civil War, Custer had gained a reputation for being fearless and aggressive. However, he had a reputation for being reckless, taking big risks with the lives of his soldiers. You wouldn't want to be a soldier under his command. 10 years later, Custer was still that same type of soldier. Like everyone else in the 7th Cavalry, Varnum had great respect for Custer and was still proud to serve under his command. Still, Varnum could not help but feeling that maybe this time, Custer was being too reckless. Custer could not help but see the whole village from the top of the hill because it extended several miles along the river valley. He only saw the very edge of the village. Beyond that, there was at least 10,000 Lakota Sioux camped along the river, including as many as 2,000 warriors. And the Lakota were not alone. They had allies. The Arafoe and Cheyenne were there as well. In the past, the tribes had often gathered in this valley of the Little Bighorn River because it was good hunting grounds, and there was plenty of water nearby. In 1876, with wars raging all around, they had all gathered in this place. Among the thousands gathered together was a famous Lakota holy man named Sitting Bull, along with a great warrior chief named Crazy Horse. Many members of the Lakota had tried to live on the reservation. They had signed treaties with the federal government. The treaties said it was their land and no one else's, but settlers moved in anyways, and the reservations kept getting smaller and smaller. At last, the Lakota left the reservations. They packed up their teepees and traveled along the plains into Wyoming and Montana to hunt buffalo and live free. So the Lakota had tried this with the government. They tried living on the reservation, but after they saw how they were being treated, they had no rights, they had no food or resources, they weren't allowed to hunt. They decided, no, this is going to kill our people, and they packed everything up and they moved. They had told the Lakota, the top of page 77. Of course, the U.S. government wanted them to go back to their reservation. They had told the Lakota to return by midnight on January 31st, 1876, or there would be war. The Lakota did not return, and the Black Hill War started the next day. Sitting Bull was a famous spiritual leader, known among all the Lakota and their allies. He had told his people to have courage in their war against the Washizu. This is what the Lakota called the soldiers and settlers, Washisu. The true meaning of this word is not certain, though some have concluded that it means, quote, people who take the fat, or someone who is greedy. So they called the American settlers, the founders who were coming in, the Washisu. These were the people that were taking advantage of all tribes. Anxious and uncertain of the future, the tribes gathered in the valley in the early summer of 1876 because Sitting Bull was going to perform a sun dance. The sun dance was an ancient sacred ritual. During the sun dance, Sitting Bull prayed for a vision of the future. He asked the spirits what would happen to his people. Sitting Bull predicted that the Lakota would win a great victory in battle. Sitting Bull was not the only important leader in the great village on the Little Bighorn that day. Crazy Horse was there as well. In some ways, Crazy Horse was a little like Custer, bold and reckless. In battle, he rode straight at the enemy, but no arrow or bullet ever found him. All the warriors were happy to follow Crazy Horse wherever he went, because he had always found victory. So we have four major characters in this chapter. We met two: Custer, the leader of the regiment; Varnum, the scout leader; and now we've met two Native American men. We met Sitting Bull. He was the Lakota holy man, the guy who had gathered all these people in the first place; and Chief Crazy Horse, who was the warrior chief that everyone respected because of how successful he was in battle. You would want to serve under him if you were a Lakota man, because he would bring you to victory. We're going to be flipping to page 78 and 79 now. Right now, we're on page 78 to 79, picking up at the top of 78. After talking with Varnum and his scouts, Custer ordered his troops to prepare to attack the village. Custer planned a surprise attack, but he soon realized that was impossible. After all, the Lakota had scouts too, and it was not easy to hide a cavalry regiment for very long out in the plains. So think about the open plains of an area like Montana. Look at the picture below as well. These are very flat areas, very little hills. A cavalry unit would be hundreds of men on horses. It would stick out after a little while. You wouldn't need a very good scout, just people walking across, looking across the field like, who's all that? That seems like a lot of soldiers for no reason. The regiment had 11 companies, each with around 50 or 60 men. So they had around 550 to like 650 soldiers total. Custer divided the regiment into 3 brigades or groups of companies. So he split his army into 3 parts. He sent 3 companies with Group Brentine and another 3 companies with Major Reno. Custer kept the largest force of 5 companies, totaling 210 men, under his direct command. At first, Lieutenant Varnum was a little disappointed when he learned he was going with Reno's force. Varnum wanted to ride with Custer in the main force. So Varnum, the leader of the scouts, thought that, hey, Custer's reckless, but he has won a couple times. He is a commander. 79. Custer did take several of Varnum's scouts because he needed them to guide him to the village. The Arikara and Crow had long been enemies of the Lakota since the days before any Europeans knew about America. Therefore, Varnum's scouts were willing to go and fight with Custer. However, as he was riding out with Reno's troops, Varnum saw his scouts preparing for battle. They were singing their death songs, which means they did not expect to survive the day. Custer took his brigade to the north along the right banks of the Little Bighorn River, looking for a good place to cross and attack the village. Reno crossed over the left bank, and his troops moved north of that side of the river. Soon scouts were reporting the Lakota knew the soldiers were coming, and they were not running away. Custer sent a messenger to Reno and ordered him to attack the village and force the Lakota to come out and fight. Custer, meanwhile, was a mile or so upriver, and he planned to attack at the same time, creating chaos and confusion at the village. So one end was at the start of the river, and then Custer's force went all the way to the top, and they were hoping that both of them could attack the village in between at the same time for chaos. Reno's brigade dismounted their horses and approached a few teepees on the edge of the village. They moved in a line, cautiously, with the troops up front and the officer, including Lieutenant Varnum, to the rear. As they approached the village, Varnum saw children running away. Several women mounted horses, and they were forced to ride out and shoot at the soldiers. Then the warriors arrived. At first there was only a few. They hid in the tall grass and fired their guns from a distance. Reno's soldiers and the Lakota shot back and forth for about 20 minutes. One of Reno's men was wounded during this time, but that was all. However, Varnum was a trained and experienced scout, which means he had good eyes and a good sense of what was happening around him. He realized that the Lakota warriors were gathering behind a nearby hill. Varnum sent a scout to see, and sure enough, he reported, there were all at least 500 warriors there. Before Varnum could warn Reno, the soldiers rode down their horses all around from behind the hill. So, you may say, oh, that's 500 soldiers. That's pretty close to what Custer's army had at that time. Remember, Custer had split his army into 3 parts up the river around this village. Imagine that one part of around 200-ish men or less. 500 soldiers came from behind the hill and attacked them. They would wipe them out pretty quickly, and that means they now have the numbers advantage on the other 2 groups. The ground shook and the air filled with the war cries as warriors swarmed towards Reno's brigade. Bullets and arrows whizzed all around, and then the soldiers began to fall. We're going to pause right there on page 79. The next sentence is going to take us over to page 80. Picking up on page 80 to 81. Panic and fear spread throughout Reno's brigade as they realized they were outnumbered. Reno also panicked. He ordered his men to mount their horses, but then he ordered them to dismount and then to mount again. At last he simply ordered everyone to retreat, and they ran or rode away as fast as they could. They reached the top of the hill, but the Lakota were everywhere. It might have been the end of Reno and all of his men, except Captain Bennett's brigade happened to appear at just the right moment. Today that hill is called Reno's Hill. Reno and Bennett stayed on that hill the rest of the day, all night, and into the next day. All the while they expected Custer and his men to rescue them at any moment. Custer never made it across the Little Bighorn River. He tried, but only he and his men were halfway across. All the rest of the warriors from that huge village came out to meet them. The only survivors of that fight, the only ones who lived to tell the tale of, quote, Custer's last stand, were Native American warriors. Custer and every one of his men died that day. So, Custer knew his troops were being attacked up the river, and while they were crossing it, that's an illustration beneath me of the art. While they were crossing the river is when the majority of his men died right then and there, and the rest died going up the hill trying to rescue the rest. Custer and his men, some of his men, probably made it to the top of a small hill. There they might have formed a circle and fought a little while longer before being totally overrun. After Custer was dead, all the warriors went back and attacked Reno and Benton and their men. They fought all of the day and into the night. The fighting began the next morning, but the Lakota learned that more army soldiers were coming. Soon after, the Lakota broke camp and scattered across the plains once again, and the war continued. Sitting Bull's prediction was correct. Crazy Horse and the Lakota warriors did win a great victory that day. It was their last great victory. Less than a year later, in May of 1877, after many more battles, Crazy Horse and the rest of his warriors finally surrendered to the Wachisu. So the Wachisu, remember, was their word for us, the settlers. So the Lakota men and warriors won that battle, yes, but they were not going to win the war, especially with more and more army soldiers coming from the east to the west, taking over this land. They could continue fighting, but they were not going to be able to fight back the tide of the incoming settlers. Final paragraph at the bottom of 81. As for Lieutenant Varnum, he remained in the cavalry for many years and continued to fight for the few remaining Lakota and the other men who dared to resist. In 1890, he won the nation's highest military award, the Medal of Honor, for his actions fighting the Sioux one last time near a place called Wounded Knee. So in a moment, we're going to look at the rest of our notes. We're going to look at our four major characters or players in this historic event. We have Varnum, the scout leader, Custer, the leader of the company, Sitting Bull, Sitting Bull, the Lakota holy man, what he wanted, and then Chief Crazy Horse. We're going to look at what each of these men, what was their motive for going into this fight, and then what was the resolution, what happened to them. Our first major historical figure I want to look at the motive and resolution for is General George Custer. He was the leader of the American soldiers in this battle. His motive, well, he wanted to end the Indian Wars by eliminating the Lakota tribe. He thought by ending these wars or by striking this big of a blow against this gathering of tribes that he could end the violence, hopefully, before creating more. But as we now know, the resolution, he died at the hilltop and was famously called Custer's Last Stand. Take a moment, filling in our character notes. Our second major historical figure was Lieutenant Charles Varnum. He was in charge of the front leading scouts. His motive was to gather intelligence on the Montana tribes. He was the one who found this initial gathering in the first place. And then the resolution was he actually survived and was given the Medal of Honor for his apparent brave deeds, or at least for surviving this and showing bravery. The first of our two major historical figures from the Native American tribes. First we have Sitting Bull. He was the Lakota holy man. His motive was he wanted peace, that's why he was gathering all these tribes, but he allied with the Lakota against these invaders. Remember, a lot of them had left in the first place. They had left their reservation because there was nothing else there to feed their families or to hunt, so they wanted peace, and they allied with the Lakota against invaders. The resolution of their tribe was victorious, but they would surrender eventually, within the next year, actually. So they may have won that battle, but they were not going to win war or the changing times. Lastly, our final historical figure we're going to look at their motive and resolution for is Chief Crazy Horse. Remember, his motive was he wanted to lead the tribe in battle to victory, but the resolution was he defeated Cutler's regiment in battle. He may have defeated Custer's regiment in battle, but as we just talked about, their tribe would surrender within the next year and go back to the reservations and go back to similar schools like we talked about yesterday. Motive, wanted to lead the tribe in battle to victory. Resolution, defeated Custer's regiment in battle. Lastly, beneath your notes, we have a little section to wrap it up. So, what were the outcomes? Native Americans, we can put this all together. Crazy Horse and the Lakota Warriors won, but it was their last victory before surrendering in 1877. So that's what would be next for these tribes. And Custer's U.S. troops, we had the Custer's last stand. Him and his men died and lost that day. We had a few survive, but overwhelmingly, the majority of them died, and it was deemed a loss. So let's take a moment and return to our big question from the beginning of our chapter. Why was this battle important in the shared history of European settlers and Native Americans? For Native Americans, it showed a few things. It showed that if you left the reservation, it was not guaranteed that you would either survive and your tribe would prosper. So the Lakota left their reservation, they got together with these other tribes, they had a big gathering, they won this battle, but still eventually they had to surrender. It did not mean that they could keep their tribe. And then think about how this impacted European settlers. We had a pretty big regiment go out there and then try and move this tribe back, but it resulted in a pretty bad battle. Custer's Last Stand is a very notorious massacre. It was a complete loss of human life. So we know that this just continued tensions and elevated the anger on both sides, and it would only lead to more bloodshed before eventually things started to calm down. I would say, of course, now there's no bloodshed and the Indian Wars are not happening. But this was just the peak of that kind of behavior and conflict between the two groups. We're going to wrap up here for today, scholars. The next thing that we have tomorrow and Thursday, we're going to be reading Chapter 10. Chapter 10, I'm going to split into Wednesday and Thursday. There will be a part 1 and a part 2, so make sure you watch the videos each day. I will not be reading it alongside of you. I'm going to split it into 2 sections and give you very guided notes. So you're going to go to a paragraph, and then you're just going to tell me the main idea of that paragraph before moving on to the next. On Friday, I will be putting up another video as well. Friday is going to be our assessment on Unit 8. It's going to be all in Edulastic. Of course, I'm not going to be able to supervise and check if you're not using your reader in your notes. So I'll say here that if you've watched this far, I do not mind if you use your reader or your notes for your test. It's not going to tell you the answers. There's going to be a separate article in there anyways, but it'll be a good source of enrichment information and maybe some supporting details if you're struggling to find some. If you have any questions or concerns after watching the videos, give me a call or a text. Just as a reminder to a few scholars, make sure that you're double checking what time it is before you give me a phone call or a ring. I might not be able to help you. Mr. Shion's getting up there in age, so if you're calling or texting me at 11 o'clock at night, I might already be passed out in bed or something like that. So try and make sure you could do it probably before 7:30. That's before around when I get pretty sleepy, so I'm not checking my phone as much. In the meantime, stay safe and have a good day.